Testing 1, 2, 3. Mentioned it, but when we get to question and answer, I don't know if you're doing question and answer, but when we get to it, if so, repeating the question is super important.
Okay.
It's not for this room. Everybody can hear everybody in this room, but the live streaming, they can't hear a thing from the audience because it's all pointed directly at you.
All right.
So if you can repeat it, that'd be fantastic.
Good deal. Good deal.
And for some reason, I'm just printing my settings, so I'm going to just do intros with my computer in my hand.
Sounds good.
These things happen.
Good deal.
I love being able to improvise. I love it when improvisation is
This is easy.
Yeah, we are ready when you guys are.
All right.
I always talk for just a couple of minutes before we get started, so I'll start with that. Feel free to run back and grab food. If you haven't already, that is for you. Just about some things that are coming up next week, Wednesday, May 17th, Waffle Wednesday. It's going to be happening over at Startup Hall, which is over on Campus Parkway, also known as Condon Hall, one of the ugliest buildings in the UW campus, but incredible waffles, just tremendous waffles. And you should go over. It's one of the most popular events that CoMotion hosts. Tons of people go over, they network, they have delicious waffles. It's a lot of fun. We're talking about doing something like that here in Fluke Hall. We're talking about, like, do we want to do Topic Tuesday or something else? If y'all have suggestions on that, just let me know, because we're trying to figure out something for next year for this building. Friday, May 19th, that's next week, right here doing the same thing. We're going to have Salish Chutampe talking about raising capital from the entrepreneur's perspective. That's going to be really a very special event. He's the CEO and co-founder of Mobisanti, and if you don't know what Mobisanti is, it's the first company that created an ultrasound device that was basically an app on a cell phone. And that sounds in some ways really silly, why would you do that? But if you live in a country where the closest hospital to where you live is, many, many miles away over bad terrain, that sort of thing can be just an incredible life-saving technology. And he's also written a book about technology at the margins, which talks about how the mobile industry is changing healthcare in the developing world. And he also managed a lot of innovation investment at Microsoft. He managed about $100 million in exploratory research investment, focusing on personalized medicine, bioinformation, and systems biology. So he should be a great guy to talk to. And then on Monday, May 22nd, we don't usually have Monday events, and this one will be at CoMotion HQ, which is the new building that's over by Trader Joe's. There's going to be a really neat event that I have my daughter that night, so I'm dragging her to it because there's no way I'm missing this. High innovation impact for a sustainable food system. CoMotion is going to be working with the Good Food Institute to talk about entrepreneurs and researchers in high impact sustainable solutions for the food system. So they're going to be talking about clean meat, bat meat, basically, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, industry investment, plant-based proteins, the enormous potential for change in the food industry through alternatives to factory farming, which I think everybody would like to have. So Patrick Gray is here today, and we're super proud and excited to have him. Patrick is we are. He's kind of a legend in Seattle Biotech. He's worked with a lot of small companies on extremely aggressive timelines for drug discovery. Genentech, ICOS, Macrogenics. He's now the CEO of Biomune.
Yep.
And now Biomune has a U.S. partner called Pascal Biosciences.
Yep.
With an S. And they're here in Fluke Hall. We're thrilled to have them here. We're thrilled to have him speaking here today. He's worked on the discovery and development of therapeutics like Hepatitis B vaccine, Interferon-alpha, Interferon-gamma, and the P13. Did I say that right? Is it P13?
PI3 Kinase. PI3. Yeah.
We're very happy about that.
Close.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. And feel free to interrupt with any questions or comments as we go. I don't know if you noticed a couple days ago, Sean Spicer had a stand-in, and it was her first time trying to defend everything. And she started out by saying, "It's my five-year-old's birthday today, so don't give me a hard time." And my kids are a lot older than 5 years old, so you can give me as hard a time as you want and ask all the questions, and we'll get started. So I thought it'd be fun to give this talk when they were asking for volunteers. And I've worked in a bunch of different startups, And that might be because I can't keep a job, but I've had 7 different biotechs that I've worked for. And I like working for small companies, and that's why I keep moving around, I guess. So here's a quick agenda, just some brief outlines on how to start a company, some background on biotech, and then I've got one slide about patents and how important they are. And there have been other talks in this format here from legal groups that have done really well, so I won't harp on that, but there's an interesting story there. And then I've never taken an economics class, but I'll relay a little bit of economics background to you. And then talk about therapeutics, which is my specialty and interest, and also give you some review of a number of different successful biotech companies. So this is a little of my background, which Kira did a real good job of, so I won't go into it much. But yeah, I went to the University of Oregon, University of Colorado, and then did a postdoc at UC San Francisco. And as she mentioned, Pascal Science is my favorite thing right now, and we're planning to have it be very successful. And we have a couple employees here in the room, so you can talk with them if you want. I'm also an affiliate professor in the Department of Biochemistry, where I teach one course a year on how to take a scientific idea and make a product out of it. And I'm also an entrepreneur in residence here at UW, which is a lot of fun. Oh, and yeah, I just have these goofy pictures here because they all have something to do with all the different things I've done during my career. So I worked on Drosophila as an undergraduate, Euglena as a graduate student, Hepatitis B when I was a postdoc, and all kinds of other things. And that's one difference between industry and academia. If you're in industry, you'll probably move around to different programs and projects, and maybe be more focused on a particular expertise that you have, but the different programs might come and go, and you can learn all kinds of different things, which I've found to be very interesting. In academia, you really become an expert on whatever it is you're focusing on. So just some quick operational details, and these are relatively straightforward, and you can find out about them online, and I've got a few places to go in the next slide. But basically, you need to start out with a plan. I'm personally not a big fan of business plans. An official business plan is usually 150 pages long, and nobody can sit through reading all of them. So an executive business plan is usually 10 pages or so, and that's even hard to get through. But if you're starting a company, regardless what it's for, it'd be nice to have a good idea what you're planning to do, and how that's going to work, and who it's going to benefit, and the financials are important too. So I'll get into that a little bit. So you need to determine your legal structure, a limited liability corporation if you've got something small. If you've got a store, for example, my wife had an antique store for 10 years, and she had an LLC. I've got one because I do consulting, and I'm the only employee in it. If it's a corporation, there's going to be a lot more involved, and you'll probably want to get lawyers to help out with that. And then nonprofit has a different legal structure too. So it's real easy to do a lot of these things. To incorporate, you can get online, and in about 15 minutes you can get you can apply for a business license from the state of Washington. You'll want to set up banking if your company's going to be buying and selling, and you're going to want to buy and sell through your company. You have to register for state and local taxes, and you have to be good at keeping track of this stuff too. I'm late almost every month paying my $10 or $15 for my LLC. Finding space, that's not easy, and Kira was very helpful here. We searched throughout the area, and this ended up being a wonderful situation for us. And in Seattle, the greater Seattle area, there's a huge range of real estate in both costs and locale. So that can be tricky. Name your company. I bring this up. The reason we changed our name to Pascal from Biomune is that the scientific founder of Biomune, in spite of the fact that he spends most of his life on the computer and Googling things, he never checked to see if there were any other companies called Biomune. And in fact, there are 3 other entities called Biomune. And none of them have bothered us. Some predate us by 20 years. But I felt if we're very successful, someone is going to come along and give us a hard time. So you can do that just by Googling, but it does make sense also to get a lawyer that specializes in trademark law. There's actually a very nice presentation a month or so ago on trademarks, and it's very straightforward, but just check things out before you get started. Intellectual property. Hopefully you have some intellectual property if you're in the biotech world, because it is critical. And then financing is critical too. So I'll be talking mostly about therapeutic companies. And therapeutics are require a large amount of financing. And so I'll go into that in detail. If you're a diagnostics company, it's less, and things move a lot faster too. But we'll get into that. So you can find help at the Small Business Administration. It's an sba.gov. There's a state website on here. Commotion is a great place to go if you have any affiliation with the university. They're always very helpful to help out. And then Foster School of Business. Often they'll work with Commotion, and you can get a neophyte business person that's in business school to help you out. And they usually have good contacts within the business school. So there's help out there, and it's a good idea to track it down. So one slide on intellectual property, and this is an interesting case, and it's locally interesting and pretty sad. There was a company called CellPro in the early 1990s, and they had developed a mechanism where the technology came out of Fred Hutchinson. And they had a mechanism to separate out CD34 positive cells. And those are primordial stem cells that make all of your blood cells. And so if you could isolate a person's CD34 positive cells with an antibody, and they were able to do this ex vivo, then you can then hit the person who has cancer really hard, and then give them back their own stem cells and repopulate everything. So it's a cool technology. They noticed early on that there was a competing technology from Johns Hopkins University, and they could have licensed that. They went to a lawyer who is actually an old friend of mine, and he told them that they didn't need that technology, and that theirs predated, and they were all good. They didn't need that technology, so why buy it? Because otherwise they would have had to pay some royalties to Johns Hopkins. Well, Johns Hopkins ended up licensing that technology to Baxter and Becton Dickinson. They filed a lawsuit, went to court, won the lawsuit, and the next day, CellPro was pretty much bankrupt. So their stock went down to nothing. They closed their doors, and that was that. This is all documented really well in the reference that's listed here, and it's a good read. It's 30 or 40 pages, something like that, but it's pretty interesting about the court case and the science behind it too. This is my economics slide, and I'm certainly not an economics expert, but it's certainly important if you have a company. This is George Akerlof, and he was an assistant professor in 1970 at Berkeley. And he came up with this idea called asymmetric information. And the general idea is that if one party, the seller, has more information than the other party, the buyer, then that asymmetric information can be problematic for a market. And his example was used cars, and so that's why it's called the market for lemons. So a lemon is a bad used car. And certainly in 1970, there weren't any apps to check out your car and figure out if it had been an accident or how well it's been taken care of. And so the seller has all that information. The buyer doesn't. And it hurts a person who has a really good car, because a buyer is never going to believe that it's been really well taken care of. And so the market ends up getting hurt. And in extreme cases, it can actually destroy the market. Well, he submitted this paper, and the first journal that he submitted to rejected it. Second journal rejected it. The third journal rejected it. And then finally, he got it accepted to the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which I understand is not a real highly rated one. But he had the last laugh, because 30 years later, he got the Nobel Prize for this work. And then even more interesting, his wife is Janet Yellen, so she's the head of the Federal Reserve and more famous than he is. So how does it relate? It's a good story, so that's why I like to tell it. It does relate to biotech and industry in general, in the sense that you really need to know the value of what you're trying to develop. So if you're starting a biotech, it's nice to really have a good understanding of what you're doing and how much revenue you're going to be able to make, and particularly if it's therapeutics, it's real difficult to make those predictions. But you ought to at least be able to convince investors that you have a rationale for the numbers that you come up with. When I was at Genentech, they underestimated their growth hormone sales by about 40-fold. And then a couple of years later, they overestimated their tissue plasminogen activator cells by about 40-fold. So on the average, they did pretty well. But the reason they're owned by Roche right now is because they overestimated their TPA sales. And the company grew too big, too fast, and that ended up being a big problem for them. So I'm going to talk mostly about therapeutics, because that's what I know about, but biotechnology really has a lot of different types. And so in addition to therapeutics, there's medical devices, diagnostics, veterinary health, agriculture, energy, industrial enzymes that are important for chemical processes. And then there's all the organizations that help those industries along. And in particular, if you're a small company, you'll probably be dealing with a lot of contract research organizations. And even big companies do too. So you might work at Pfizer or Merck, and you'll probably outsource toxicology work, because it's easier to have that done. And you can actually be a very small company, come up with a really good product, and have about 5 people in the entire company for your entire length. I have a friend that started a company. You've probably seen this eye drop that's advertised by this is the woman on Friends. That at any rate, she advertises this it's for dry eye, and it's called Lifitegrast. It was sold to Shire about 2 or 3 years ago. And that was all done with about 5 people in the entire company. Everything except the chemistry was outsourced. So I'll talk about therapeutics and drug discovery and development. And again, ask any questions if you have any. So biotech therapeutic companies really require a lot of cash. And the cost of a new therapeutic, according to this Tufts Center, which is funded by the pharma industry, the cost is over $2.5 billion. And they come up with that number by looking at the number of products that get approved and everything that goes into that. So it includes products that are approved and make money, and it also includes products that are failed. And so that number's sort of inflated and not reality. But that much money is spent on R&D throughout pharmaceutical and biotech industries. So they're really the most research-intensive industry. So about 12% of spending goes into R&D, which is quite a bit more than most industries. And it's an incredibly risky business because only about 1 in 10 products end up getting approved. And it makes you wonder, and it also takes a very long time. So it takes about 5 years to discover the average drug, and then it takes another 8 years to get it through clinical development and approved. So you'd only really do that if there was a big reward at the end, and there is. So, because pharmaceuticals are about the most profitable branded products as far as something that you can touch. Software, I guess, is better than that, but it's a pretty good deal. Pharmaceuticals have a really high profitability associated with them. Since I've been in the industry, I've really seen the sort of approval rating take a big nosedive. And you know, back in the 70s and 80s, pharmaceutical companies were really highly ranked as far as the public felt, you know, they're doing good things. They're coming up with life-saving drugs. And now they're kind of at the bottom of that, unfortunately. And that's in spite of coming up with some fantastic medicines in the past 30 years or so. You know, there are drugs now for MS, for example. There weren't any prior to 1990s. There have been a lot of great advancements for cancer, some for cardiovascular disease, and yet somehow we're kind of at the bottom. I still don't know why. We're also a real easy target. So when healthcare costs are always complained about, probably the first thing that gets brought up is that drugs are too expensive. And the reality is that they only account for about 10% of total healthcare costs. So even if they were free, you wouldn't make a whole lot of a dent. But nevertheless, people don't like big pharma, that's for sure. And the U.S. market does drive the industry because that's where the majority of the profitability is. So why is it so difficult? You know, I mentioned only 1 in 10 drugs get approved by the FDA, and the FDA has 2 requirements at the end of the day. It has to be efficacious and it has to be safe, and that bar for safety is very high and kind of continues to get higher as time goes on. And the other reason is there's lots of good drugs out there already. So if you come up with a new drug, it has to be better than what's already on the market. And it's a tough industry. The science is just complex. So you've got diseases often have multiple targets, particularly things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes. There's a lot of different things going on, and then the compounds that you come up with can have off-target activities that can be real difficult too. So it is difficult, and a lot of these things we do animal models in spite of the fact that they often don't relate real closely to what's going to happen in humans, but you have to do them anyway. So just dive into this a little bit more. The development process is listed here. So the drug discovery, I mentioned, takes about 5 years before you're going to get into humans. So that's going to include figuring out what the drug is and then doing all the preclinical pharmacology, the toxicology, ADME, all the safety work in animals that needs to be done. And then once you file your IND, investigational new drug, then you can, once you get approval for that, which can only take a couple of months, that's pretty fast, then you can go into clinical studies in humans. And so phase 1 is usually a safety trial with a small number of volunteers often. Sometimes they're patients. It depends on what the indication is that you're going for. If it's cancer, you can go right into people that are ill. And you're trying to get a good safety signal and figure out what the pharmacology is. What's the half-life, for example? Phase 2 will be more a much larger study on the order of a couple of hundred patients, perhaps. And hopefully there you'll get your proof of concept in humans. And this is going to be really important because then you have some confidence that the drug actually works. And you're going to pull the trigger on a much bigger study so the costs keep going up and become much more significant. So the early stage stuff is really pretty small costs compared to the later stage. And this doesn't say 2.6 billion because this is actually for a product that would work and you'd go all the way through. This would be one where you would have good results all the way through phase 3. That phase 2, the proof of concept, will tell you how you want to design your phase 3, which is going to prove to the FDA that it really does work. And then it takes a year from the time you finish that study, you write up all of the information, give it to the FDA, and then they can approve your drug.
Sorry.
Yeah.
If it is a biosimilar, for example,
yeah.
Where does that enter in this flowchart?
So the biosimilars are real interesting because they have inherently kind of done everything, but the FDA doesn't just let them jump in there, and you have to. It's a little bit different than small molecules where you can come out with a generic compound that chemically has the identical structure, and there it's much more straightforward. And with a biosimilar, you have to show equivalence, and the molecules are generally so complex that it's difficult to show that they're exactly the same. So, you know, if you're working with an antibody, it's 180 kilodaltons, and you know, the glycosylation is not likely to be completely identical, and there'll be some heterogeneity within the product anyway. So I'm not all that familiar with the biosimilars, but it's a lot easier path, but you still have to go through clinical trials to show equivalence and demonstrate that the pharmacology is acceptable, and just, you know, again, it's safety and efficacy. Yeah, you have to show that it's safe, and you have to show that it's efficacious. And the other thing about the biosimilars is they seem to have not knocked the price down of the original drugs a whole lot, but it's been interesting to see them just start to come on the market, which is just beginning to happen in the U.S. In the EU, it's they've been there for a while now. So discovery paths to successful therapeutics is kind of taking a step back to starting up a company. And just historically, pharmaceuticals have come from a variety of sources. In rare cases, the product has actually come out of academia. What's more likely is that the basic science is discovered in academia, and then that is used by pharmaceutical or biotech companies to come up with actual drugs that are then used. And then within industry, they also do a fair amount of research that's applied research, very directed on particular targets, and have come up with a lot of drugs just within industry. There have been a number of companies that have started out in one direction and have completely changed the products that they've gone after. Gilead is a good example of that. They were started in the late 1980s, entirely focused on antisense and trying to use antisense oligonucleotides to manipulate expression of a variety of genes. And they banged away on that for quite a few years, and in the mid-90s decided to become an infectious disease company, and they started working on HIV, and they're one of the biggest biotechs. They're bigger than a lot of pharmaceutical companies now. Vertex and Bio-Rad are similar in that they took secondary paths that made them be very successful. Unfortunately, these days, that's really hard to do. You usually don't find investors that are willing to let you take a bunch of different shots on goal. So I'll just go over some of those success stories. There's a couple drugs that were entirely discovered in academia, and one of them is Pregabalin, which comes from Pfizer. It was discovered by a medicinal chemist at Northwestern University, Richard Silverman. And so this drug is known as Lyrica. It's one of the top 10 drugs. I think it finally went off patent in 2015 and made about $3.5 billion that year. Northwestern University did real well on the royalty for that. They were being paid pretty significant royalties, and then about 5 years ago, they just took a payout from Pfizer of $700 million. So I think that's the biggest check that's been written for an academic product. The Pcsk9 inhibitors. So that's a drug target that was identified by a number of different academic groups that were focusing on the genetics of individuals that either had very high or very low cholesterol levels. And there was one group of individuals that had a mutation that caused an increase in the expression of Pcsk9, and there were other mutations that reduced its activity. And so that made it look like it'd be a good thing to inhibit. And when that work was figured out in the 2003, 2005 time frame, a number of pharmaceutical companies jumped on it and made antibodies and got them approved really pretty quickly, considering the timeline from the scientific discovery to the actual products being out there.
Pat?
Yeah.
Richard Silverman?
Yeah.
What was his overall take from all of that?
I don't know what they. So the question for Northwestern University is how much of that 700 million, and it's more than that because they did that after I think 4 or 5 years. I don't know what his take was, but most universities have royalty agreement with professors, and I'm not sure what it is for Northwestern. I'm sure he's doing very well. They named the department after him and some new buildings and stuff like that. So he's doing okay, I'm sure. I'll give another example that's interesting because it was really discovered in industry and then went from a good-sized biotech to a startup that was spun out of that, and then got picked up by a big company. So there was a target called PI3 Kinase, and there was a delta isoform that Christy Wood in our room actually helped identify the molecule and characterize it. And because it was solely expressed in certain types of lymphocytes, it was thought to be a good target. And this work was all done at ICOS, which is a company up in Bothell. Hen used to work there, or by there, and that's where I met her. It kind of languished. It's a project that went on for a good 6 or 8 years, and there were some good compounds. There were small molecule inhibitors of this enzyme, and it kind of ran out of steam, and there wasn't interest within the company to push it forward. So there was an individual, used to be my boss. He left the company, and he was able to convince them to spin the product out. And he started a company called Calistoga, which raised, over the life of this program, about $86 million to go through the phase 1-2 and into phase 3 clinical trials. And they demonstrated efficacy in leukemia and lymphoma. And at that point, it was bought by Gilead. So Gilead came in and paid about $600 million for the product. So this is one of the, at the time, I think this is 2011 or 12 when that sale occurred to Gilead. And that was one of the biggest things really in venture capital throughout the US, but particularly in the Seattle area. So that was a very good deal for Calistoga and the people that worked on it. Gilead continued to develop the drug. It got approved. They're actually selling it now. It's had some issues with toxicology, and I think they'll work through it. It is going to be a good drug, and so it's a good success story. And I'll mention a little bit about how that goes on, and I talked about how expensive the whole process is. So the $86 million that Calistoga raised wasn't, they had to run around to get all that financing, and it was venture capital finance. They didn't get all $86 million into their bank at one time. It's done in a tranched fashion. So they got a little more than $10 million to get started, to get the product from ICOS, and then begin to move it forward. And then as they hit significant milestones, they were able to get more money from the initial investors, and then additional investors were added as time went on. And then everybody did real well. As it said, there was about a 7-fold return on the investment there, and that's what venture capitalists love. So that was a good deal. Yeah.
From an aggressive timeline standpoint, what's your perspective on dilutive versus non-dilutive funding? So I'm not talking about the magnitude of money available, but really in terms of getting stuff done quickly.
Yeah, I think so the question is dilutive versus non-dilutive financing, and how does that affect your timeline? Non-dilutive financing, so grants, for example. All investors love that because it adds more money into your coffers, but it adds validation that there's scientific validation to what you're doing. And so non-dilutive financing is great. If you've got a company and you've got venture capital, then I think it's always helpful to go after that. But also it adds to the timeline in the sense that that you've got the grant writing, review, that whole process. It takes like a year from the time you start writing to the time you're going to get a grant. So it can, if you're dependent on that, then it can slow things down for sure.
And you can't spend federal dollars outside the U.S., so it limits your development.
In some cases, that's true. Yeah, it kind of depends on what you've got. If it's an SBIR, and you can justify that work can be done only outside the U.S., then you can get an exception for that. But you're right. They say in the guidelines that you better spend your money in the U.S. Yeah. So yeah, U.S. For a U.S. grant from the NIH, you pretty much have to spend it in the U.S. if you can, and if yeah. So like we're Pascal, but we're wholly owned by a Canadian company, and so we probably won't be able to write SBIRs. So how? Yeah, this comes back to the grants. How do you finance? And if you're a therapeutics company, it's hard to get grants that are going to cover the amount of money that you're going to need. Early on, that can actually be very helpful. And like I mentioned, it's helpful for the validation. So applying for grants is a good thing to do. And the money that you're going to get might be used to expand other programs too. Pharma partnerships. So if you're an academic laboratory, you might be able, if you're working in an area that pharmaceutical companies are excited about, you might be able to get a research agreement where that work is paid for in return for a tie to it by the pharma company. And then the other way would be just technology acquisition. So if you've got a laboratory, you've come up with something, you've patented it, then a company can go to CoMotion and acquire that technology. And you have to keep everybody happy when you go through that process. But yeah, there's a number of ways to do it if you want to get a partnership. And then investors is the other key thing. If it's a therapeutics play, angel investors might get you off the ground, but the amount of money that you're going to get started with is often pretty small from them. Venture capitalists are going to be able to provide in the multiple millions to get started, and often that's what you really need. And then public markets are important too. So getting onto the New York Stock Exchange or on the NASDAQ is a way to get public investors, and that really varies a lot with history and the time that you're in. The past couple of years have been really good for biotech companies to go public. And usually there's a window that lasts a year, 18 months, and then people get tired and don't want to invest so much anymore. And so it's very cyclical. And that affects venture capital too. So in the past couple of years, venture capitalists have made a lot of money by having their companies go public. And so their coffers are pretty full now, but they also know it's going to take a while before this window is going to open again and that they can sell companies again. So just to summarize, you should have a plan. That's always helpful, and to have an idea of the direction you're going, but also what's the value of what you're going to try to create, and so I think that is important, whether it's a therapeutics company or if you're a CRO trying to provide a service for a pharmaceutical company. So having good understanding of how much money you can make is important, and also how much everything's going to cost. Intellectual property is critical, and then financing is always kind of the toughest thing that you can do. And I mentioned here, don't be underfinanced. That's always a huge problem, and there's always an issue. And the issue is, once you get an investor or two, it might not be what you really want to raise, but you got to get going, and you're really excited, and you start your company, you get going, but you're really only halfway to that milestone. And that can be real problematic. So investors like to see their money used appropriately, and they like to see you hit those milestones. That's going to make them excited about writing another check for you. So it means that you need to write milestones that investors are going to like. They have to be meaningful, and that's going to enable you to get more money down the line. So thanks for listening. Any questions?
Any thoughts on, I know your emphasis was on therapeutics, but paired diagnostics with therapeutics, particularly in the precision medicine areas?
It's becoming real important, and certainly has been for past 10 years or so, I think, and continues to be more important. 20 years ago, you just wanted to get your drug approved and sell it to as many people as you could, because that increases the size of your market. But it's so hard to get any drugs approved these days that if you can identify a subset of a population that's going to respond well to your drug, then you're definitely going to want to be able to do that. So, cancer is a great example where people have been able to identify particular subtypes of a tumor that should respond well, and so that works out great. It limits your market a little bit, but on the other hand, you get your drug approved, which is a huge deal. And then in the cancer field, you can kind of charge what you want. So, yeah, Hen.
What's the minimum threshold to get the attention of a venture capitalist?
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of the ones that I know don't have very good attention. Oh, okay, yeah. So what's the minimum thing that you can get the attention of a venture capitalist? And the venture capitalists I know have really short attention spans. And so it's hard to maintain any kind of attention. So I don't think I know how to answer that question, to be honest. But I think the things that are real helpful are scientific validation, and different VC groups are kind of look at the world differently too. So there's one here in town called Arch that I used to consult for, and they just like cool science, and so they're fun to work with because they like cutting edge science that has a huge potential, but a gargantuan risk associated with it. So they started Juno, which was sort of the reintroduction of gene therapy, and really kind of kick-started that whole field again. They recently started an infectious disease company called Vir with the Gates Foundation. And so they like doing these big plays that are really scientifically unique. And then if there's that scientific validation, so if it's looked on as being sort of first-rate, published in first-rate journals, then those kind of VCs would be real excited about doing that. Yeah.
Is it much easier to bring a new drug application for an existing drug to the market? Say an interferon immunomodulator to treat asthma?
So is it easier to bring a new drug to market that's already been in patients?
Yeah, it is in the market, and then you
Oh, to get a new
develop it
indication?
into new indication.
Yeah. So if there's a drug that's already approved, then you don't have to go through all that safety testing. So all the preclinical work's already been done. The safety testing in humans has been done, and you can often go into a late-stage trial. And so,
It is not in the U.S., it's okay, say Mexico, Spain.
yeah, and the reality is that clinical trials are really done throughout the world, and the FDA recognizes good clinical work throughout the world. And they'll have site visits to different hospitals and just to ensure that the work is being done well. And there are certain diseases where either they're so rare you have to go all over the place, Thailand or Eastern Europe, all over the place. And then there's other indications where the disease isn't found in the developing. It's only found in the developing world, not in the developed world. And so, it's real possible to go into just about any country these days. Yes.
Say you get your drug approved by the FDA and everything. As a small business, how do you ensure widespread distribution, or are you just kind of hoping to get bought out by like Gilead?
Yeah. Again, it depends on the indication. So if it's for a product that's say cardiovascular disease, then you're going to have a hard time going up against the big pharma companies, and so you'd want to do a partnership on that. If it's for a real small orphan indication, then you might be able to do it all yourself. And that kind of goes back to the history of Genentech. Their very first project was to make human insulin, and they did that with Eli Lilly. And then they decided that they'd do their own program on human growth hormone. And they did that because there's, in the early 80s, there were only a couple thousand, I think there were only about 1,000 pediatric endocrinologists. And so with a small sales force, they could get everybody. And then there were a few things that really happened in their favor. Unfortunately, there were individuals getting human growth hormone from cadavers was the source. That was the only place you could get it before Genentech came on the market. And a couple individuals came up with Creutzfeldt-Jakob, which is prion disease, which is fatal. And so that product got taken off the market, and Genentech was the only one there, so it worked out well for them. I'll do one on the way back.
What is the main benefit of starting up a company over collaborating with big pharma? Because as you mentioned, financing the startup biotech is very expensive.
Yeah.
So, for example, I discovered a new drug target and it's promising, but why would I start up a company over that? Because it's like long process, expensive.
Yeah, I think it all depends on the particulars of the whole thing, really. The Silverman one that I mentioned, where he came up with Lyrica, that was one where he did the whole product, and because he's selling, or Northwestern University is selling the product to Pfizer, they got a really high royalty rate. If you have a target, there's so many targets. It's hard for a pharmaceutical company to get real excited about it. Typically, they would like to pay a whole lot of money for something that has proof of concept in humans than pay a little bit of money for something that hasn't gotten into the clinic yet. So it's kind of a goofy way to do it. But you know, if you can get a pharmaceutical company to back you and you can get a good royalty out of them, then you're going to do real well. So.
Can I have a second question?
Sure.
Can we start up a company out of other people's findings?
Out of other people's findings? Yeah, that's a real good question because you know, in the scientific world, you're almost never alone, right? There's always competition. If you're doing something interesting, then there's going to be competition. And so, yeah, then you get into the area of patents. And if your work is protected, then depending on what other people are doing, it may not matter at all. So, yeah, most of the drugs I think that are out there have you know, been on the backs of basic science, and pharmaceutical companies have profited from them. So, sure.
I have a slightly different type of question. I look at the long period of time it takes to get something approved, and I look at that as an opportunity to potentially do things differently. I understand the desire to balance things like human safety and other factors, but with advances in technology, with the ability to potentially optimize some of that process, do you think that do you see that changing in the short term? And if so, how much of that is a bureaucracy factor versus potentially, are there opportunities to make it better? And if so, what companies or organization, or is that something that really needs to happen from the FDA side for that to really happen?
So to summarize your question, do new technologies enable speeding up the drug discovery process? That might not be exactly it, but
well, I'm thinking more at the process level, right? There is a certain process that works a certain way.
Yeah.
If something actually works, trying to get it to market much faster means saving a lot of lives versus, you know, it's balancing that safety because we don't want to hurt people versus potentially trying to make it faster because it's actually good for people and we can potentially save a lot of lives.
Yeah.
So do you see that changing, or do you think that's something that as companies approach this, it's always going to be potentially that long?
I think new technologies are always helpful in the scientific world and also translated to the drug development world. I worked at Genentech for about 9 years, and they were always at the forefront of recombinant therapeutics, and you know, they continue to be. And they would often use technology to stay ahead and make lives difficult for competitors. So you know, they were always coming up with better methods to characterize a product, and you know, they would set a new standard, and so the FDA would assume that other companies would follow on. So technology, I think, often doesn't speed things up, but it probably makes products better in the long run. There certainly are efforts to try to speed things up. Everybody would like that. It would save pharmaceutical companies money. They'd make money faster because they'd get things on the market. There are certain indications where you can circumvent the process to some extent. Cancer is one of them. Merck actually has their Keytruda, which is the anti-PD-1. They got approved after a phase 1 clinical trial. And they did that because they wanted to beat Bristol Myers, which was ahead of them, but they were kind of going through the standard phase 1, 2, and 3. And so Merck did this mother of all phase 1 clinical trials with a large number of people, and they got it approved after phase 1. So sometimes you can do things like that. For ultra-orphan indications, often you can get things approved. You still always have to demonstrate safety, but if you can see some efficacy, you get things approved often after a phase 2. Cancer, that you can get things done after a phase 2. It all has to do.
You have a fast track, right, where you can do the post-market surveillance.
Yeah, right, yeah. In fast track, that whole path sort of speeds up the bureaucracy of the FDA to some extent. Yeah.
Would you elaborate on the timing of scientific paper publication when it comes to patenting innovation? Because, especially scientists in academia under the pressure of publishing new stuff. But once you publish, then that comes under the scrutiny of the your patent is not issued,
Yeah.
and then you cannot disclose and things like that. And that if you apply patent in a premature stage, then patent never issued. And so I wondered how you manage that.
Yeah. So the question has to do with patenting and timing. And if you're in academia, you want to get your publication out as fast as you can. But on the other hand, you want it to be protected too. So when you submit a patent, you have at least 18 months before it's going to become public. And so you can submit a patent. Most of the companies that I've worked in, they're happy if you submit the patent coincident with submitting the publication. So there's always a worry that once you, even though the publication review process is supposed to be secretive, you don't want to get that information out until you actually have a patent. So I think it's prudent for companies really to make sure that a patent has been submitted, and even if you're in academia too, you don't want to give away those secrets until you have a patent figured out. So if you think there's value to it, to your work, you should talk with Commotion and let them know. And they're real good about the fact that they realize that scientists, their whole careers revolve around publications, and so they work to get the patents out real quickly. So, and it's a little different in the U.S. versus the rest of the world, but the key thing is 18 months after you do your filing, then it can be public information at that point in time. Yeah.
How are monopoly laws with therapeutics? Because I know a big part of it is, you get it, you patent it, you're the only one who can produce it for X amount of years. So how do monopoly laws sort of go into that?
Yeah, it's I'm not a lawyer, but I do follow the industry as much as I can. And yeah, once you have a patent on a drug, you can be the only one selling it. And so until it becomes off patent, then that's when it's going to become generic. So you see this process of 13 years from the time you discover till the time that you can start selling your drug. If the patents are for 20 years, so you don't have a whole lot of time, and there's a couple things that pharmaceutical companies do, and also the FDA and regulators, government realizes that it does take so long, and you can get some of that time back. I think you're allowed 7 years of drug development process to be added onto your patent. So that helps. And then the other thing is, if you're it's especially true for small molecule compounds. Pharmaceutical companies probably aren't going to patent a small molecule until the latest they can, because if they think it's really good, then they want that patent date to be 20 years out if they can. And so that can be a little difficult to explain to some academic folks, because you have to keep that absolutely secret, and that can be tough sometimes. Yeah, one more.
So if I had developed actually an Interferon-alpha modulating drug to treat asthma as a prophylactic treatment.
Uh-huh.
And I'm an inventor. So I would like to discuss it with you because it is within your field. Can I do that later?
Sure, be happy to.
Yeah, thank you. It's an existing drug called the glycophosphopeptidase, AM3, and it modulates interferon by acting on the Peyer's patches of the intestine.
Ah, okay.
And I use it to treat asthma, and the results were very, impressive because it reduced symptoms, it improves symptoms, it reduces inflammatory markers, and
It sounds
in the
very
long
interesting.
term.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Okay,
We can do
thank
that
you so
now.
much.
Good deal. Well, thanks for listening. That was fun.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for answering all